Yo, what up, guys? We're on the clock. It's your boy Caleb back with another podcast, and today I'm joined by a guest, somebody who actually I've had the pleasure to learn from a little bit more directly in a basketball sense. I'm joined today by James Kerti, who, if you don't know, he is a basketball scout who has spent numerous years kind of in the independent ranks and also working with contracts with teams all across the United States. And more recently, we had the pleasure of working together, or not really working together, but more me learning from you through the Sports Management Worldwide kind of online sports school. James, how are we doing?
Doing great, Caleb. Thanks for having me on today. It's been a pleasure getting to know you through the class, and it's exciting to get to be here today with you.
Yeah, I hope the introduction did you justice because I mean, I'll say for one that I respect your basketball opinion a lot. You've put some like we kind of talked about before the podcast, kind of talking about how our years are going. We've been kind of laying the groundwork. You were a big part of laying a lot of the groundwork for my kind of understanding that I've especially built off of, and this audience has kind of seen as I've been growing, and this podcast network is kind of like a catalog of like my experiences and growth as a basketball scout. So I feel like it's no better to have somebody on here who has had an impact and a role in that. So thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely, Caleb. I appreciate that. And as I've transitioned over the years from like really actively scouting to just kind of being in more of a teaching and mentoring role, it makes me really happy to hear that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to kind of start at the beginning. I know that we just talked about kind of recently, but I feel like it's always important, and in the episodes in the past, I've kind of made sure that we get a really good framework, again, kind of talking about building a base. And I feel like to get a really good understanding of how you appreciate basketball, or how you kind of utilize the informations, how you analyze, it's always important to kind of figure out with like who's the person that we're talking to. So kind of learning about you as a person, maybe a little bit through basketball. What are kind of your first experiences with basketball?
Well, I remember growing up in the mid 90s watching those NBA on NBC games. I think that was one of my first introductions to sort of the spectacle that is the NBA. I got into the NBA before I got into anything else. I had a couple friends when I was a kid who were really into basketball, and you know how it is when you're best friends and you're an impressionable young mind, you kind of latch on to things. So I think for me, I started falling in love with the game by virtue of some of the people that I was friends with when I was a little kid and as I was growing up. And um, I grew up in suburban Philadelphia, and the Sixers, Iverson, those teams were really coming of age, when I was going through high school. So that was something that I really gravitated toward. And watching those teams play, and again, just watching the spectacle of the NBA in the mid '90s, it was something that really made an impression on me.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And I talked about actually on the previous episode of this series that when I was talking to Chucking Darts, the Chucking Darts basketball podcast, and I was talking
Sure.
to him kind of for me, it was the like the mid 2000s, like kind of like the Paul Pierce and the Dwayne Wade, and kind of seeing like those teams come of age, LeBron coming of age. There's something about like entering basketball kind of during like the uprising of players that just really gets an emotional connection out of you. Would you say that you're a big Allen Iverson fan then?
Yes and no. I mean, I loved watching him when I was younger, so I'm always going to have that level of respect and admiration for him as a player. I think like as somebody who scouted for a long time, like I don't particularly find myself drawn toward players who have that style of play, but the intensity, the attitude, the determination, the motor. I mean, I think that like those are all things that you can look for, even as you can maybe look at a guy and go like, that's not like the archetypal guard, for instance, maybe that I as a scout find myself drawn toward. But you can also, like I said, look for the respect and the kind of level of admiration for different traits and different characteristics in a player.
Yeah, he's quite the scouting juxtaposition, the undersized score first guard with, extremely great intangibles and, kind of everything that you want in like a developmental prospect. So kind of interesting there. I didn't even think about that. How he's kind of like a polar opposite. Um, What does like finding a career in basketball look like? I know it's kind of jumping, but like where did you kind of find the road? Obviously, you have this understanding that okay, this basketball thing something that I really like and really appreciate. And where did that kind of turn into maybe this is something that I should take more seriously and look at as a possible career option?
That's a really good question, man. I think for me, there's kind of like two inflection points in my early 20s. The first, so I went to college at Villanova, so I stayed in the suburban Philadelphia area, and I happen to be very fortunate to be landing there just at a time when that program was really taking off again. I graduated in '09, and at the time, I believe this has since been eclipsed, but the '09 class ended up being the winningest program, the winningest class in school history up to that point. They won like 25, 30 games almost every year. Went to the Final Four my senior year, and I was just obsessively went to games at the to the detriment of my education.
Hmm.
Not my basketball education, to be clear. So maybe that was all for the best. But just being steeped around the game, getting to be around the team, the whole experience, getting to travel to games, that was something that just made me realize what an appreciation I had for that and how much I liked being around it. And then after I graduated with a degree in computer science, started working at a software company, and I just really realized that the things that I was going to school for to study, it just wasn't for me. And I needed to do something that was, going to be more aligned with, my heart, my sense of passion for one, but also just something where I felt like I could be at my best, where I felt like I could shine. And I found myself thinking, well, I mean, there's this whole basketball thing. That's the thing that I kept finding myself drawn toward again and again. And even though I never played at a high level, I hadn't coached, but I'd been around the game a lot just as a really serious hardcore fan. And I guess I've always felt like I have tackled fandom and watching sports from more of like an analytical point of view than a kind of a traditional get really into rooting for teams and players point of view. So I started looking for ways that I could give that a shot at that time.
Yeah, I think that we share that in common. I'm a very I kind of talk about me for a moment, not to interrupt, but if you can see behind me, I have a Bears Devin Hester card here, and obviously, so those of you who maybe know me a little bit better are like, yeah, obviously, Caleb, you're a Bears fan, but I'm from Wisconsin, so I have quite the juxtaposition of fandom, so I can kind of understand maybe not direct perspective, but I never had like a huge affiliation with any teams. I'd say like I was more of like just a general sports fan. Like I like seeing the game played the right way. And I think especially with basketball, I mean, when I look at, kind of when I've turned this corner, and this is where I can kind of relate to you, James, is, a lot of these things in school that I'm experiencing right now pull me in a lot of directions and, kind of trying to fit into the 4-year degree program mindset can kind of be a detriment because I do have this great passion for basketball. And obviously, the people that have been tuning into the podcast network probably think, how do you have time to go to school at all when you're still putting out all this stuff? But the biggest thing that think that we have in common with that, though, getting back to the point was,
Mhm.
I don't really like the team, like rooting for teams. I never found it that fun. I always liked seeing the game played the best way. And that's I mean, I don't know, how do you feel about the 13-14 Spurs? I feel like for a lot of people in this generation, some of those Spurs teams really defined where they went with their basketball mindset, like moving towards eventually what became the Warriors type of offensive juggernaut and ball movement, classic basketball kind of coming back in this modern variation. What were kind of your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great team to pick out, Caleb. They shine brightly in my memory almost a decade later as, one of the most transcended basketball watching experiences that I've had. And to what we were just talking about a minute ago, too, the difference between kind of that fan culture and community versus, what I've encountered being around the game. I just think a lot of like what we do in life and where we land with our careers, it's a matter of finding ourselves drawn to, the people that feel like our people. And I going back to even when I was really young, I never felt at home with the fan experience. I mean, and not to talk badly about my alma mater or anything because every group is like this, but like I remember being at games as a Villanova student in the student section, and like, you get drunk students sitting around you like cussing out your own players when they miss a foul shot, and it's like, like this guy, like he's one of us. He's one like what he's 22. Like, what are you doing? Like he's on our team. Like, why are we getting mad at our own players? And again, I grew up in Philly, which is like the ground zero of booing your own players for stupid, ridiculous reasons. And then as I actually found myself like around people in the game, I think, you know, um, this sometimes people ask me what surprised me the most about being around the game, about working in the game. And the thing that surprised me the most, honestly, is the kindness of people in the game. Just what a welcoming community it is, how kind people are, how when you have a group of people who are just so passionate about what it is they do, there's just like this infectious kindness everywhere you go. And I think that for people on the outside, there are stereotypes about athletes and coaches and how competitive everybody is. And yeah, people are super competitive, but at the same time, it's a very welcoming, inclusive community. And that always surprised me, previewing my career journey a little bit. Like when I started scouting and I started even just being on the very periphery of like sort of being able to say that I worked in basketball, it shocked me because I found myself as a very new high school scout going to games and sitting with college coaches and in some cases like Hall of Fame coaches who treated me like with kindness and respect, even though I mean they had absolutely no, obligation to or reason to. And it would just stun me that I'd be sitting next to I don't want to name drop anybody, but like sitting next to somebody, it's like, man, like I watched you coach on TV for 10, 20 years growing up, and now you're sitting here talking to me like you respect me as a basketball mind, even though like we just met. Have done nothing to merit your respect and kindness, but I just found myself having those experiences over and over again, and it just blew my mind.
Yeah, I will say that I mean, for example, having this conversation right now is representation, not only of yourself, but of the type of people I try to associate myself with in this industry. And like you said, it's almost hard to find those people that everybody's trying to down talking and saying, "Oh, these people are so off-putting with the way that they are that you can approach them." But I mean, most people that I find are just often just care more about the game than the actual like anything else, honestly. People care about the quality of the basketball conversation more than maybe how well the vibes are. If there's conversations going in directions that can benefit everybody, normally people are going to be attentive and want to hear what you have to say, which is something that I've always appreciated. I mean,
Exactly.
especially in even if they don't agree, they will want to hear what you have to say. You know what I mean? So they can either walk away from and be like, "Oh, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about," or "Oh, maybe I should cue back in and ask him what he thinks about this
No,
player." But um,
no, exactly.
and
And
talk,
then, now that you mentioned that, I'm going to name drop just once because it's relevant to what we were just talking about. I remember, I think it was still in my first year as a high school scout. This was back in like 2012, I think, summer 2012. I don't remember exactly where I was, but it was some very hot, poorly ventilated gym in the summer in 2012. And I somehow found myself at a sparsely populated game, sitting on a bench next to then SMU coach Larry Brown.
wow, that's
And I mean, of course, how could I not mention like, Iverson, the Sixers? And I didn't have like a gooey little fan moment, but, respectfully, talked about, I mean, I was like 25 at the time. I was sitting down with Coach Brown. I, talked to him like, growing up, watching Iverson, watching you, a lot of respect for everything that y'all did. And, just like getting to have that conversation, like while we're both there to work, it's just something that really stuck with me.
yeah. I mean, wow, that's cool. I mean, being able to talk to a guy that literally just talked about, kind of your first experiences, that's something else. I remember for me, I did get a chance to do a podcast with Jim Paschke, and that was kind of when I grew up. I wanted to be a broadcaster. For me to meet like the Fox Sports broadcaster for my area, I'm like, whoa, this was kind of cool. And then to be able to sit down and talk to him, and like you said, it's just neat to see how again the people in this industry, I was always able to just talk Jim's ear off about whatever I wanted to around the Bucks. And I mean, for
Yeah.
you to be able to have those conversations, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it grew your appreciation for the game even more. I mean,
It did. It did. No, absolutely. I mean, just the fact that it was that everybody was so inclusive and so welcoming and considerate and, made me feel like I had something important to say, which I think gave me the confidence to keep going, even when, you're first starting out. It's you don't know you're not always going to be seeing results right away. So knowing that people are being encouraging is helpful. And that's something that I've always tried as a teacher and something of a mentor at times, I guess. Like that's always something that I've tried to pay it forward.
That's awesome. So kind of keeping along this line of kind of talking about the industry before we probably pivot to more of just basketball conversation.
Sure.
Um, where do you think the industry's changed and how is it changing with kind of obviously the social media is a huge thing. And we see people kind of skipping, not necessarily skipping, but finding their way to opportunities that are different probably than I mean, I can't say personally, but I'm asking how different is it now, the landscape of like getting a job in basketball now that social media is such a prominent thing in our lives, and kind of the routes have opened up, or do you think that there's still the same kind of concrete, work, do this and this kind of route?
Well, just to clarify the question, are you thinking like now compared to 10 years ago, 20
Like
years ago?
somebody like Mike Schmitz can kind of, wedge
Yeah,
themselves into becoming a general manager off of,
right.
mostly social media and online content work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely a big opportunity for people is that there's so many more pathways to get your work out there, and not be subject to, frankly, traditional gatekeeping. I think that there's with all of those opportunities now, there's more opportunities for people who are just starting out or people who've been at it for a little while, like to showcase their personality and what makes them unique. I think that that's an underrated feature in all of this because people like to hire people that they feel like they know. And if you're able to get yourself out there on in terms of writing, in terms of video, in terms of whatever the work you do, and let your personality be a little part of that, I think that that's really meaningful. And there's just a lot of ways that your work can get shared a lot more easily than it used to as well. So those are two of the main things that come to mind for me. And then obviously just the other big thing too is, particularly if we're talking about the NBA route, there's just a lot more jobs than there used to be. I look back at, I mean, even just when I was starting out 10, 15 years ago, coaching staffs were a lot smaller, ops departments were a lot smaller. You didn't really even fully have analytics departments. You had an analytics person or two. And now you have like actual departments. So there's just simply a lot more jobs out there, than there were in the past. And that makes everything a lot easier. I mean, granted, you still have 10,000 people competing for every single job, but at least there's more jobs.
Yeah, yeah. It seems that like I think you said this even when I was taking your classes that there is more jobs, but that also means that there's going to be more people realizing that there's more jobs. Or you said something along those lines that just because there is more opportunity doesn't mean that the opportunity is going to become easier. With all these people that are going to be aware of the opportunity itself. Um,
Yeah, and I think
it
one other
may garner more interest towards the sport. I feel like, do you feel like the basketball industry is growing as the game is growing globally?
Yeah, I think so. And one thing I definitely do wanna highlight. I mean, even though you and I are both sitting here as two white guys, the amount of opportunities that have opened up for women and people of color, by virtue, I think, of some of the things that we're talking about here, the ability for people to put themselves out there without having to go through traditional channels. I think that that's also really important, and that's bringing a lot of important, diverse perspectives to the game. So I think to your question now, like how is the game growing? I think it's becoming less homogeneous, and as stylistically talking about the basketball itself, like stylistically, as things continue to evolve, I think that we're going to see more and more innovative thinking because we're not just seeing the same kinds of perspectives getting through the front door over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to applaud you on that point. That is something that definitely is worth highlighting. I am as somebody who is working on a little bit on the women's side and does a little bit of scouting for that stuff. I do see how kind of that's a sport that I like. It's a in my opinion, I think it's a completely different sport at this point. As I think the NBA game and the European game are almost drastically different just based off the rules, the styles, the coaching, the strategy, all those things. And when you take somebody who's never really looked at the game this certain way, and place them in a different perspective, even just moving like a variation of the sport, not only like taking into account like of a whole different life experience, a whole different playing experience,
Right.
how different things can be viewed, are always something that, I appreciate. And I think that, obviously I think we have that in common. I think more and more people, as the world opens its minds, to kind of, the last 100 years of history that we've had, and plus, I think that these type of changes will only be, more common. I think we'll only see more representation, not only in sports, but hopefully across the rest of our country and all sorts of industries and places. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah, I feel like that's a really important message to spread, and I appreciate you taking the time and reminding me that it's probably is an important thing to look at. Just the diversity, in jobs, and trying to look at where people can kind of make their difference and make their impact, and making sure not only they get heard but other people. So, kind of pivoting, like what are some goals that like you would say that you started with, kind of getting into basketball? What are some that you have achieved, and then what are some that you still have?
Man, that's a really big question. I think at the beginning, at the very beginning, it was I think one of the maybe this sounds kind of silly, but of the different milestones that we do. I know for me, one of the first things that made me feel kind of successful was like the games that I was able to get credentialed to as a scout slash writer, just knowing that I was able to, go to X, Y, or Z college basketball game and get credentialed by an NBA team was, a pretty big milestone for me that I was able to achieve. And um, another one was when I was starting out as a high school scout, the fact that there were people who were willing to, help pay or subsidize me to get on a plane and stay in a hotel and sometimes the middle of nowhere. Like I remember one of the first national grassroots events. I was living in Vegas at the time and there was a lot there, but I had the opportunity to go to like Little Rock and Indianapolis and Dallas and a few much more random places than those fairly large US cities. So that was something for me. Just being able to get paid to travel and go to games was something that I looked at. And then it was being able to get some consulting projects with NBA teams and then actually getting paid for some of those projects. So I think looking backward at just kind of what my process was, it was just kind of looking at the next thing that looked a little bit shiny because in an industry that's really driven by passion and work ethic, I think it's important to have goals for yourself that actually feel exciting, that aren't just about checking boxes, but where you're really going to get a sense of excitement and satisfaction from doing that. So I think those are some of the major goals that I had when I was first starting out. One big goal that I had for myself that I ended up growing out of was, someday working full time in a front office role with an NBA team. I did interview and get fairly deep into the interview process a couple times, but I just eventually, honestly, got to the point where I had to do a little bit of looking in the mirror and saying to myself, like, is this really what I want? Do I really want to move to get a job where I move to so and so place and work 80 hours a week for probably not that much money realistically, and just throw myself into this? And for a good bit of time I thought that maybe the answer was yes, and then I eventually got to the point where I started thinking maybe the answer was no, and that's when I transitioned more into doing a few projects here and there and teaching the class through which I met you. And through that, I feel like I've been able to make some connections and do some work that is kind of more aligned with how I want to live my life and what I want to do. The word legacy is a big word, but I want to be helping people. I want to be helping teaching the game. I want to be helping people get opportunities to pay it forward and do what they're here to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a very noble thing to kind of set aside maybe some of the higher aspirations that you have, to kind of accomplish things that are more, not to say more like realistic, because I think that to set a capacity on anything that anyone can do is a, wrong or unintelligent decision to make. I'd say that everybody has limitless potential, for them. I'd say for the most part, as long as they're willing to work for it. But I think it's pretty noble. And I definitely was appreciative of the time I spent in your class. And I think that, obviously it's carried us to have another conversation here today, but, you know, for myself, not to make it, I do appreciate what you said, but I want to be able to figure out like the route to ultimately get to these goals
Yeah.
and whatever goals I may have. And I think it's an interesting perspective to have for yourself, to say maybe these things like and weigh that out at the time. And I'm sure that maybe I'll have to make that decision down the road. And maybe there's somebody who's listening who's maybe thinking about that decision right now, whether maybe it's a decision to that some people have where they want to start pursuing a career in basketball versus continue what they're doing and think about maybe I should pivot careers or something like that. But it is an interesting it's an interesting I never really think especially at 21 years old. I think for me to think about like settling on a goal is very for me it's like very hard to like get around to, but I think it's important to hear your perspective. What would you say was your ultimate goal that maybe you didn't reach, or an aspiration that you had that you kind of had to settle for or maybe could turn back to at some point?
Well, I think like a lot of people, I had at various times I had dreams of, working my way up and being a GM someday. I think anybody who's, interested in basketball and front office work, I think a lot of people that's
That's
a big
that's what
part
I
of their
figured.
vision
That's what
someday.
I
Yeah,
figured.
that's the goal, that's the vision. And I mean, over time, it was something that I started feeling maybe more inclined to just being a highly placed consultant or advisor or something. I know some people who've kind of gone that route and found value in that. So there's always kind of been little ideas like that floating around in my brain. To what we were just talking about, I feel just kind of from a goal setting perspective, I think it's good to develop an understanding of like who you are, your heart, your brain, your mind, with the way that you approach goals. Because I know that there are some people out there who like having some big vision of where they want to be in 20 years is incredibly motivating to them. For other people, I count myself in this category. Trying to attach myself to where I want to be in 20 years is just incredibly overwhelming and stressful. For me, just pulling it back and just going like, what is the next thing that feels kind of fun? What is the next thing that feels exciting? The more I was able to adopt that attitude and that mindset, just the more that I was able to build momentum and keep going forward. And my path adjusted so much along the way. Um, I think about childhood friends who, by the time they were 9 years old, they were like, oh, I want to be a brain surgeon. Sometimes you just have people in your life who just know exactly what it is they want to do, and they're absolutely sure of it. And, while I had times, like I said, where I was like, I think I want to be a GM, like that was always more of a pie in the sky idea than something that I was like, oh, I would bet my life that this is absolutely what I want to do. So understanding myself and learning to understand myself and what drove me and led me to focus more on just taking these small little steps, making these small little bets on myself and letting myself adjust course when things sometimes didn't go according to plan and sometimes in ways that were kind of exciting. I looking backward, I couldn't have predicted the journey that I had in basketball. If I had tried to plan for it, I certainly would not have been able to do it. But I think the more that you give yourself room to follow inspiration, to follow chance and happenstance and serendipitous connection, sometimes that can be a really positive difference in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. My mom always had this saying of shoot for the stars, land on the moon. Uh,
Yeah.
Kind of setting those like out of reach goals that, could be achievable maybe with a lot of hard work, but you may find yourself in a different place that's just as exciting where you can get just as much done and have, a valuable experience. So, I absolutely agree. And I appreciate the wisdom. I think one last piece of wisdom that I would seek from you, is as someone who is trying to aspire for a career in this industry and anybody else who's listening, like what is the one major piece of advice? I know you've dropped a lot of nuggets throughout this podcast so far that I've appreciated. What is like one concrete piece of advice that you wish that you would have heard when you were 25 years old, kind of first getting into your steps in the space? What would you say?
The advice I always come back to is to find ways to be of value that are unique to who you are. And I'll give a really specific example because I've had a lot of conversations like this with people over the years. like I've had a number of people who are like kind of analytically inclined, some of them from basketball backgrounds, some of them from financial backgrounds, other just random industries, like trying to like take like their analytics experience and kind of push their way into the game. And sometimes I would talk with them about projects or portfolios or things that they might be working on that they think might be of interest to NBA teams. And where I would see a lot of people kind of start going a little wry, getting a little stuck, and where I would try to steer them away would be like they'd come to me with these ideas and they'd be like, James, so I just came up with this new formula for ranking NBA players. It's, they'd explain to me something that's like kind of like per or win shares or VORP or block box score plus minus or any of those things. And I just kind of stop them and I go, look, like I think that's a really, I mean, cool idea. Like it's interesting, but like in what way is that useful? In what way is it helpful for anybody to have a ranking that says that like LeBron is really good, basically? Because that's what a lot of these boil down to. Like if I am a front office person for the Atlanta Hawks, like I know LeBron's really good. If I can ever get LeBron, like great, give me LeBron. But like you giving me a system that says that like LeBron and KD are really good and so 15th man isn't really good, or that two comparable middle of the rotation players are comparable middle of the rotation, like that doesn't do anything for me. But if you can take your know-how and your experience and just the uniqueness of who you are and do something that's actually going to like answer a question or solve a problem for somebody that like somebody might actually have, like I think I can share this. I was interviewing for a job with the front office. I want to say it was 2016. It was 16 or 17, but they had just the kind of reworked the CBA. And one of the new additions at the time was the concept of two-way players. The two-way contracts were brand new. And as I was interviewing for a job with the team, I wanted to go the extra mile. So I put together a little special project. And what I did was I wrote to them, I said, look, this two-way thing is new. Nobody really knows exactly what it's going to be yet, but like I took the time to kind of dive into the rules and I went through the whole league. I mean, this took me hours, but like I went through the league, compiled a list of players eligible for two-way contracts and kind of created like a prioritized list with some basic scattering reports of like these are some guys that you could get on a two-way contract who might be available. Like you might want to take a look at this. And they thought that was great because like they have a finite amount of front office people. The amount of human power that they had to explore two-way contracts was probably limited and it was brand new. And whether or not they actually used anything I gave them, I don't know. It might have just gone in a drawer, but it was at least within the ballpark of something that like might be useful, and certainly more useful than if I had written to them and said, hey, I have a new formula that says that Kevin Durant and LeBron are really good.
Yeah, absolutely. I I think I personally I took a lot from that because um and I mean I don't have to really like mince words about what I'm working on, like somebody who may have like a contract or a consulting gig, but I can just flat out and say like I'm developing a rating right now that's going to be potentially used to rank like college basketball prospects. And where I kind of think that where that may differ from something just ranking NBA players or is ranking like college players you're kind of projecting. So a big thing that I want to kind of incorporate is like analytics and other stuff like that. So it's funny that you kind of brought that up when that's something that I'm going to look into and kind of weigh how like what the plausibility of it is. There's so many people that try to rank stuff like that. So I think when you do something that's very niche, and a lot of people look at things that like searching these niche things like doing like a shot deep dive or a chart deep dive on players just for specific games or like specific stretches and periods. That is the type of more niche work that teams and companies are looking for because it is like it's engaging content, you know what I mean? Because it's valid, it shows you something that you didn't know, you know what I mean? Um, so I appreciate that. And I think big thing that a lot of people that I see and work and talk to more closely, like my coach Julian and other people that I've worked with closely at On the Clock that are on the younger basketball experience side. A lot of us have all these really great ideas and want to talk about this and project this and analyze this and evaluate that, but not a lot of us are willing to sit down and actually do a lot of the work and a lot of the grunt work. And I think that, like you hint at, you're like, this spent several hours and it may have just gone in a drawer somewhere, but I did it. And I went there and I presented it to them and said, if you want, are interested in me, this is another thing that I worked on. Like, look at the things I can do that, like you said, present value. And it may not seem value to me, because I think a lot of people, on the younger side, and definitely, I mean, this is just multiple experiences I have with like two or three people specifically, where it's just like, if I don't see the results right away, then necessarily the work isn't going to be put in at all or at any point. Like if they don't know that, if they were going into the same experience with as you, and they would have been like, well, they may not even care about the two-way thing at all. They just wouldn't do it. So I think it's a very important thing to acknowledge that a lot of the work that sometimes we have to do in this space is going to just completely go overlooked.
Yeah, well, one other thing to add to that, now that you mention it, and I'm going to admit to an NCAA violation right here. So on your podcast, you have a former scout admitting to committing an NCAA violation.
Fine. Well,
When I
welcome
was
to mine.
exactly when I was scouting high school basketball, I was working with a unnamed scouting service, servicing a bunch of colleges. Like one thing that I found was, so the way that the scouting services work, or at least worked at the time, this was like 10 years ago, is like a college would sign up with your service and you would then send them scouting reports throughout the year on like a fixed cycle. And you were supposed to give every college exactly the same information to present a level playing field. Now, whether that's really the way that people did it, debatable. But anyway, what I found though is that I would talk to the college coaches that I was working with, and I'm an inquisitive person, and I would try to find out like what their process actually was, because I thought that my job was to try to make their lives easier, because I am a freelancer outside of basketball as well. And when I work with clients, I understand part of my job is to make my clients' life easier and to solve problems for them. And I would find myself talking with these coaches, and I'd say, well, like when somebody sends you a scouting report, when one of these scouting services that you work with us, I know you work with others, when somebody sends you a report, what do you do with it? And they go, well, I'm like, well, what do you mean? They're like, well, honestly, like sometimes they're like dozens or hundreds of pages. Like it's just like, what am I supposed to do with that?
Read
And
it.
but it's like, what time do they have to just read hundreds of names that aren't even in any sort of like obligatory? I mean, maybe they're like ranked, but like if you're, I'm just going to pull a random school out of my head. Like if you're UC Santa Barbara or something, and somebody sends you a prioritized list of like 100 names, like how do you go down the list knowing which of those guys you can actually get? Like it's like, what do you actually do with this? So what I started more doing was coming up with much shorter, much more readable lists that were targeted to the individual school, so that
Yeah.
see Santa Barbara isn't looking at exactly the same kids that Duke is, because that's a waste of time and I'm not forcing them to do the work. Now, again, NCAA violation, take away my
Region-based
scouting
stuff,
credentials that I haven't in 10 years.
region-based stuff like that, like accounting and stuff.
Region-based stuff, targeting it to an individual school, just like really understanding
Yeah,
what it is that
so
they
that's
actually
against
need.
NCAA rules technically, because you're not giving the same exact
Yep.
information.
Yep.
Well, I mean, I don't know. That's beyond me.
It's pretty ridiculous, but I mean, you understand the principle that like you're
Even
not supposed to give
even
special treatment to the schools that you like more, but instead that means that you're sending Duke the same list that you're sending UC Santa Barbara, which is, I mean, frankly, a waste of everybody's time.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's like a college basketball video game that where they put in I just assumed this, you actually just taught me something. I always just assumed that when they purchase reports from like these type of companies, literally in the game, you go in, you click on, and before you start the season you have to purchase your reports for like all these regions and the grades. And
Yeah.
so it normally gives you like in the game it'll be like have a premium report, which is like the top 150 players. Then
It's
I'll
the
have
draft based sports games.
yeah, it is. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. I'm familiar.
Yeah, so it'll give you the three little the categories and then all the regions and stuff like that. So I'd always just assume, since that clearly seems like the most effective way to distribute like recruiting reports and information for players, I just figured that teams operate that way. But clearly I assumed too much. But I
It's a
don't know.
lot of work to go through all those names. Like it really is.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, from my perspective, you'd have to have somebody on the team themselves who would just be sifting through those reports and doing their own preliminary research ahead of time and be like, oh, these are actually a group of 40 names that we can actually look at. Let me look through here and see out of these 40 names, who do we have a report on? That's kind of how that's how I would do it. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
and most of the time, like you don't have report. I mean, if you're a college staff with a few assistant coaches, especially if you're not like, how many kids you really getting out to see? Like, really not that many of them,
Especially during the season, you're not seeing
especially during the
any.
season. Like, you're not. So even if a scout sends you, a list of names with a bunch of guys, and even if the scout like really likes a couple of them, like, what are you gonna do? Are you
Yeah.
good? Like, how many of them are you really gonna like take a day off to go drive an hour each way to go see somebody play once, and then you see them play once? Like, how much info do you really have watching them
Does
play
that
once?
make the portal really a lot more enticing then? I mean, it
I
becomes
think it
like
does, yeah, because you
direct.
have data, you have film, you have just so much more in the way of information.
You can call their coach at the same level, somebody you probably have had experience with
Yeah,
for scheduling or something like that, and can create an easy dialogue. And most of the time, that person's going to advocate for the player really, really hard. So you're going to get some sort of, either honest answer or, you may get the dirt on them. But it seems like the portal, and we can kind of use this to kind of pivot our way towards more casual basketball conversation about the
sure.
landscape, but we have some time.
Yeah.
Um, what are you thinking about the state of kind of college basketball, for one, and how do you see it impacting the program over the next maybe let's say 5 years?
I'm not really sure what sticks out for me these days, Caleb. I mean, the game's definitely changing in a number of ways. I'm of course curious to see, um, I th I mean, more so than anything stylistically, just the changes in the player pool due to, a few different
Wow.
things. One, the way, yeah, exactly. The way money's affecting the game, whatever might happen with the G League or might not happen with the G League, maybe the draft age getting lowered. Like I think that's just always the biggest area of curiosity is which players are coming into play in college and for how long and with what level of, seriousness and commitment, frankly. Um, and then seeing how the different coaches and the different programs respond to that. That's always been the thing that's fascinated me the most over the last 15, 20 years with the game.
Yeah, I think you said something there that I found kind of popped to me was like the seriousness and commitment like of the players, which is something that I think is like very underrated at this point. At least something that I see. I see a player pool now that is exponentially bigger of players that are serious and committed to turning basketball into their career. You know what I mean? Like I see more 4 and 5 year players now that seem like they may have just started this opportunity or this journey to get a degree, or players like 10 years ago would have been like, a guy like Christian Leitner, like even though he's an absolute dog and had that crazy mentality, you know, he's a player that even him maybe wasn't looking at being a pro until maybe his third year in college. Like he didn't probably realize that he even could be a pro. You know what I mean? Like didn't have that realization. And I think a lot more players now, after their freshman year, maybe having a little bit of success at the Division 1 level, or even, having a good amount of success at the JUCO level or a different level of college basketball, are now have a reason because of these things like the G League, because the game is growing overseas every single year, because the G League is just at least, achieving a level of prominence where, you know, players in the G League are coming up for certain periods of games and helping teams like win games consistently. Like you talked about the two-way players nowadays. You'd look at a team like the Bucks the other night. Giannis wasn't playing, Chris Middleton wasn't playing. They were using every single roster spot. And two-way players are crucial to help teams be able to win while still under those things. So what do you have to say about like kind of the player pool? I know that was kind of a long-winded thing, but the player pool kind of growing in terms of the seriousness and committed like to being a basketball player. You know what I mean?
No, definitely, man. And just to be clear, like I don't mean seriousness or commitment in terms of
I
like
took
a
it a little bit differently,
yeah, I didn't mean it in terms of like a pejorative or anything like that. Just I mean it like I think some of it too is like you and I have been talking today about NBA front offices and the attitudes that they have and how they approach things and how there's more and more diverse perspectives getting in there and the game's smarter. I mean, it used to be the case like not that long ago that a player's, college success, including the team's success, was considered to be a really strong predictor of success at the NBA level. And you'd see players and teams go on a run in March and really boost their draft stock up and up and up. And especially with upperclassmen. And that's just something that we're really not seeing anymore. And I think that's largely because NBA teams have eventually realized, like, you know, maybe how good a player plays for 2 weeks in March isn't actually one of the best indicators of
Mm.
how successful they're going to be as a professional. Like that's, I think, a good thing on the whole for basketball, but I think it does change how people approach the college game. And again, I'll go back to that word commitment. I mean, it's not any lack of work ethic. It's just the alignment of incentives. It used to be that the incentive was to get as far in March as you could because that was the thing that was going to have the highest correlation with you being able to have the kind of professional career that you wanted. And now that's just not the case anymore. I mean, you look at the NBA and there's fewer and fewer players who played more than 1 or 2 years in college, fewer and fewer players who really distinguished themselves through individual or team success at the college level. And I think that that's fine. I think that the NBA player pool is as good as it's ever been. And that's in part because they're no longer overvaluing some things in college that don't really matter. But I do think that that's going to mean a continued change in how things do play out in college. And it seems like the college administration, the schools are finally catching up to that a little bit and trying to change the incentive structure a little bit. It'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah. Uh, I'd be interested to see kind of how the college game, especially because we have that COVID year that kind of threw a wrench in a lot of the plans, I'm sure, of plenty of players, programs, and staffs. You know, just kind of having that year where, nobody, like a lot of players got extended eligibility. Nobody really got to show exactly what they were fully capable of.
Yeah.
And I look at it post that and the amount of to talk specifically about players, I mean, I don't know
Mhm.
how much you're keeping up with college basketball recruiting these days, but I mean, in the last several weeks, I mean, I've talked about, I think, 5 or 6 players, just kind of off the top of my head, 5 or 6 players that are fifth year grad students that really utilize the growth that they made personally in that COVID year to
Sure.
kind of extend their basketball career, you could say. A guy like, I don't know if you're familiar with Demoy Hodge, but he was player with Cleveland State, Horizon Defensive Player of the Year now at Missouri, um, has just had a phenomenal season efficiency wise. 24 years old, may not be a guy that reaches, peaks everybody's intrigue in the draft conversation, but a guy who probably, through his play just opened up many doors for him to be, a pro basketball player either in the G League or over in Europe. These type of yeah, I just think that these type of scenarios are gonna become a common thing, for especially like that tier of basketball player, where, they're not necessarily, somebody who the NBA is gonna who NBA franchises are gonna view as, a franchise builder type of player. Like, your top, I'd say, like, a
Yeah.
top 20 pick is somebody that you look at as, like, there's a franchise builder. We're gonna use him as a core piece to the next, 4 years of our plan or 3 years of our plan. Kinda that first 4-year contract, basically. And looking at players like that, it's kind of more fun for me as somebody who's growing as an evaluator, though, is because it draws a little bit less of a line in the sand of where, this guy's a pro and this guy's not. Like there's certain guys where you can kind of swing both ways and be like, if I utilize this guy this way for this period of time, there's no reason why a player like, a Demoy Hodge who can, defend 2 through 4 and can knock down three pointers at a 50% rate. There is really no reason why this guy couldn't step on an NBA court and, contribute in a way. But it's about making that investment on a player of like reaching their peak, that I think teams more and more nowadays are willing to do versus, 20 years ago, where they're going to take a guy if he's 22, 23, if they believe that he's going to win because he just led a team to, the Elite Eight in March Madness. I think that's kind of, again, a long-winded way to, solidify what you were saying, but something that I'm noticing for sure as I'm kind of working through, my beginning stages my ground building stages of my draft evaluation career, I guess. But
I like that, man. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think one of maybe the more controversial opinions that I've had as a scout and evaluator is that, I mean, I really look to a player's development more as evidence for potential future development as opposed to the idea that like they've hit their upside or that they've
yeah,
peaked. It's always been kind of confusing to me that, and I think the game's getting better at this, but I mean, for a long time, it was more like you look at that 18, 19-year-old kid as like, oh, well, like he could be anything, right? I mean, like he's so young and he's got so many tools. Like he could become anything. Whereas this other kid, he's 22 and like we've seen him get better for 4 years. Like how much better could he get? Like he's probably about as good as he's going to get. But I mean, to me, the best evidence for future development is past development. It's does this player have a track record of getting better? I mean, like I remember when like, and this is an extreme outlier, but like when Steph Curry was coming out of college, there were people who were like, "Oh, he's a great shooter," but like, how much better is this kid going to get? I mean, apparently the answer was a lot.
a
Like
lot
he was
better,
going
a
to get
lot
a
better.
lot better as a shooter, a lot. And like we've seen other guys like do that, who guys who improved in college, and everybody
Dame,
go,
Dame's
"Well,
another
how
guy.
Game's another guy. Like, how much better is he really going to get? A lot, because we've seen him get better. And you know what happens when a guy who has put in work and gotten better continues to put in work? They continue to get better. That's what happens. But like, there's this weird, like,
It's weird
sort of,
how we cut ourselves off too. We like cut ourselves off at like a certain age and a certain height, and a certain level of program. When in reality, like these are all things that should only tell us like more positive about player. Like be like, this kid Steph Curry at Davidson. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Davidson is doing this, and he's got plays with all this swagger, and seems like he has these raw intangibles of leadership. And the same thing could be applied to Dame at Weber State. Like it almost paints a picture that says to you like this guy is a clear leader, like you, and he continues to get better at all levels. Kind of, I just absolutely agree with what you're saying.
no, I mean, it's almost like you're hiring a contractor to lay drywall at your house. Like, are you going to hire the guy who's proven year over year to not only be good at laying drywall, but has gotten better every year? Are you going to hire the guy who's like
marginally good at drywall for
like he
decades.
might be really good. Like we don't know how. What if he's the best? Like we don't. Like, we haven't really seen him do it, but he might be the best in the world at it someday. So like, why don't we give him a try? He looks like he should be good at it.
Yeah, and also the thing that I don't understand is we look at these players in this period and we're trying to evaluate them when they're 19 and 20 and project it into their 28, 29 like 29 years old, trying to see what
Yeah,
they'll be when we would have much more luck, like not luck, but we'd have much more success probably and proficiency if we were guessing players at 24 what they would look like at 28. You know what I mean? Like
yeah,
for finding these role players that really can turn the tables in a playoff series, I feel like some of the perfect guys that we're looking for fall in that 22 to 23 age range because you can draft them and they're right in their physical prime. Like you don't have to wait for their body to come around for a year or two. You don't have to wait for maybe them to come around to the IQ side of the game or, get more reps on the defensive side of the ball facing this offensive scheme or vice versa, offensive reps facing this defensive scheme. They've already gotten all the reps. They've already developed and physically matured. So why are we not looking for more of these 22, 23-year-old guys early in the second round, late in the first, to be kind of these guys who are not franchise builders, but franchise like solidifiers, you could
yeah.
say?
Well, it's like everybody feels like they need to hit a home run with every pick. So you take the guy that you think
Like a
might be.
Trace Jackson Davis. Trace Jackson Davis makes complete sense on a lot of these teams to be a piece that, is your second or third, or even your first big guy off the bench, on a playoff team, maybe in 2 years. But I think he's going to get overlooked by a lot of teams because he's just, he's a junior, he's a little, or a senior, he's a little bit older. He's put in all this effort and work, and he's improved so much as a jump shooter already. How could he improve anymore? Like, how is he ever going to be capable of shoot threes? But a lot of people just use that in as easy way to not do the evaluation. I think a lot of
Yeah,
people use that in as an excuse to not go back and look at the tape and say, oh wait, I look at this guy in his pregame warmups, and Trace Jackson Davis is striping threes. Like he can actually really shoot. Like he can shoot, and I think that's that's a part of the evaluation that people don't want to go and do. They don't want to look at the pregame warm-ups. They don't want to look at the empty gym shooting because they'll just be like, oh, Ben Simmons can shoot threes in empty gym. But like you just let it sit for a second because he's not shooting in the game at all. It doesn't mean that you don't want to see what the jump shot looks like outside of the game. And these are like the nuances of scouting that I feel like people just straight up skip. Like I don't even think they like don't give it its due diligence and its like value. I just think they don't do it. I don't think they're seeking for these underlying indicators, if you get what I'm saying.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think doing that extra work of, trying to find out that information, even if you're maybe have some concern that it's not going to confirm whatever pre-existing beliefs you're bringing in. I know that was one of the things I learned over the years from one of my longtime mentors, Mark Workentine, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. Um,
Wow.
but I mean, he, really instilled in me the value in having those backroom conversations and going to practice and doing the extra little bit of work to get that information that is going to make you better, even if it contradicts some of the things that you're hoping to hear. And another thing that what you're saying brings up for me is, and look, this is human. Like, I think in order to be successful in this business, like you need to have confidence in your abilities and in the abilities of the people around you. But I think that you can also fall victim to overconfidence when you go, oh, like we have the best coaching staff in the league, Caleb. Like our shooting coaches are great, our ball handling coaches are great. So like this kid, like, yeah, his jump shot's a little funky, but our shooting coaches are so good. They'll be able to teach him to shoot. And there's also this idea that like, oh, well, like, yeah, he's not ready to play now, but like in 2 years, he's going to be really good. But like ignoring the fact that like if you do the research, and I've done the research, if a guy isn't able to get in the rotation in 2 years, he's probably not going to make it. So
Yeah.
if you're starting out on day one saying it's probably going to be a couple years before he's in a rotation, you're probably in big trouble and you should already know it.
Yeah, I'm just to kind of wrap up the conversation and maybe place like a prospect right in front of you that a lot of people um are kind of in and out on a guy like Jabari Smith Jr.
Mhm.
Like where would you be at kind of on his evaluation? Because he kind of fits in that mold of people are like, he's really 2 years away from being the kind of the player that people want him to be. Um, he is able to break the rotation. Where would you interpret somebody who's kind of at that and maybe just his game in itself to wrap up?
Well, I think so much of it is context dependent, right? I mean, he's in such a difficult situation, I think, in Houston right now, where he's
They
playing
play
with
like the least pure form of basketball in the
it's the
world.
least pure. I mean, they've got three very ball dominant young players playing around him. It's not an ideal environment for him to be able to do what he does. It may not be an ideal environment, knock on wood, for him to be able to become whoever it is that he might become. So, I always feel bad when I see players like him who just really aren't in a situation where they're able to be successful, where they're able to easily develop into who we hope that they're going to be. So that's the main thing that sticks out for me. I don't think that there's anything, wrong with him, so to speak, if he's maybe not living up to the expectations or the hype of,
He was
of
a
being
shooter.
a top pick.
He was a
Yeah,
shooter. That's what we
he's
all knew he
not
could
a
do.
shooter. He's learning how to play in the NBA.
Yeah.
He might be a good defender someday, but most kids who are 18 or 19 are not. So
Terrible.
that's fine. And he's, learning to do some of those other things. And I'm sure if he were playing in a different situation, with, players where there was more opportunities for him to get the ball in spots where he can be successful with a little less pressure, maybe some more spacing on the floor, maybe some
Yeah.
more natural passers, like we'd probably be seeing a different
He just
version of him
belongs
right
at the four, to be honest. Like, what I mean? I think that people need to not play him as a wing. I think he's just the prototypical modern four. Like, you throw him next to Sengun, they need to play Tari Eason more. So that throw Tari out there at the three. And I think that lineup just looks a lot better if you say to Jalen and Kevin, you say, guys, let's cut down on the off the dribble shooting just a little bit. Turn
Good
those
luck
in.
telling them that.
I mean, hey, neither of them are getting paid max money yet. So I don't know. As a coaching staff, I feel like I shouldn't be a slave to the players and have to like submit myself to whatever shot selection they wanna take. You know what I mean? At
That's a
some point,
really tough thing to dial back.
at some point, That's why I like college basketball. I'll say I like college basketball more because some of these things are coming out of sets, and why I did want to pick the Jabari Smith one because it was interesting because I figured it would raise this type of conversation is what is the difference between a player not succeeding because of their own doing and like a player like Kevin Porter Jr. where time and time again he's kind of found himself in these situations where really the best version we've gotten out of him is a scoring first player on a team that can't win. So guys like that, where maybe a guy like a Jabari Smith Jr. is a victim of, kind of circumstance. Where do you kind of weigh in? Do you feel like the players that are, victims of circumstance, are they non-salvageable? I feel like a player like maybe a Kevin Knox is an example of a player that maybe wasn't salvageable, or like a Bruno Caboclo or something like that. He might have been more of his own doing, like work ethic buys, but
I think I tend to be way more on the environmental side of explanations than most people. I tend to kind of live and operate out there in the sea of context. So I think that's something that I look at pretty heavily. But yeah, I mean, obviously there's guys out there who just, for whatever reason, one reason or another, they just, they don't have it. They don't find their home. Maybe there is no home for them.
yeah.
You mentioned Knox, like why didn't Knox succeed? I mean, he didn't develop enough either on the defensive end or being able to consistently knock down shots or two of the things that come to
Think about
mind.
the teams that were around him. Where was the consistency of players that he played with at all?
Exactly. And that's one of those things where sometimes all you can really kind of do is shrug and say, I don't know exactly why things didn't work out for that guy.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think these are all good thoughts to have when I like I said before the show, most of the people that are like myself are going to be team builders that are going to be hearing this. So all valid questions to be asking, at least in my opinion. I appreciate your opinion on that because I can kind of be more especially early on, I feel like I can lean more the player circumstance just because I think that a player can do a lot in their first, kind of run at it early on in the season. I think if a player like a Ben Matherin, where if they impose themselves and say, these are all the things I can do for sure, like I'll get after it, I'm going to play with hard motor, I'm going to be able to get after it and rebound from a guard position, and I'm going to play relentless defense. It may not be the most technical or most IQ
Sure.
defense, but I'm going to play defense and try to at least.
Yeah.
These are the type of like instances where I'll be like, you can really assert yourself day one because a big part of the NBA is kind of I've learned, and this is kind of I would actually really like to hear your opinion on this. Do you feel like when players go against each other, like the individual players really play to each other's tendencies? Like, do you think they really know each other in and out, inside and out? Like LeBron, when he's going up against Curry for the 20th time in his career, I'm sure he already or KD, I think he already knows all the moves he's going to try to go to, whatever spot he's going to try to get to. Maybe there's a wrinkle or two that, KD added in the offseason. Maybe his footwork on this move is a little bit different. But do you think that they just know each other's games like that?
Well, I think it depends on what level of play you're talking about. Like when you're talking about KD versus LeBron, like sure, absolutely. If you're talking about two third string point guards going up against each other. I mean, things just kind of get a lot more circumstantial. And I think when you're at that level, it's more about focusing on your own strengths and being able to claw out whatever opportunities you can to, be successful within your team. Because when you're an established player in the league, I think that you have opportunities to kind of battle and compete and to impose your will on the other team. Whereas if one of your primary goals has to be just sticking in the rotation, getting another contract.
Surviving kind of.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to approach some of those things differently. And of course, to answer your question a little more directly, like every player, every coach, every team, like everybody kind of has their own unique perspectives on what information they need to be successful. With some players, they get really into the weeds with charts and numbers and reports, and other players, they just try to focus on themselves and their habits and it's asserting themselves in the game. And I don't think that either one of those approaches is necessarily better or worse. To tie this back to what we were talking about a good bit of time ago about goal setting and how I think about that and how I approach that. Like I was saying then, like I recognize that for me, like having smaller, shorter term goals works better than having big long term goals. But there are other people where the opposite's true. So I don't know that either one of those is necessarily better. It's just recognizing what allows you to be your best and be successful. And as a player, for some players, that's getting really into the numbers and the preparation. For others, it's shutting off that part of their brain and just being able to focus on showing up and playing their best.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think you could have really answered that question better than that. Yeah, that's very interesting. I definitely feel like I'd be, if I was an NBA player, I'd be more on the intelligence side. When I play like in my pickup leagues, I always feel like I catch myself thinking about the other players' tendencies, that rather than just being like, oh, I'm just gonna move off instinct or something like
But
that.
that can also make you get in your own head sometimes too. That has
Oh,
its
it
fun.
does. When I when
Well,
I'm when I'm shooting bad, I mean, it is
right?
when I shoot bad, I shoot bad. That's for sure. It is definitely a mess. But I think that's a good spot to wrap up the conversation kind of on a lighthearted note
Sure.
about my shooting struggles, especially lately.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I appreciate your time, James. If there's anything that you want to plug, like a Twitter or a place that you're still posting writing work, or a way that you want people to possibly reach you if they have questions that you can answer more closely.
I'm over on Twitter at James Kerti. I expect you can pop that in the show notes. Otherwise, I don't really have a whole lot in the way of basketball projects going on right now.
Perfect.
But
I'll
happy
kind of
to,
throw your Twitter
have
down there.
chats like this. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time. I'm sure I appreciate it for one, and I'm sure that anybody is listening, especially to this point, definitely appreciated some of the insight in the conversation that we were getting able to get into. As always, guys, thank you for listening. OnTheClockBB.com. Go check it out. Link in the description or wherever below on the screen. We're off the clock. You guys have a good one.